There we go. I can fix. Yeah. How are you?
How are you?
Oh, another day in paradise.
Right.
Another day in paradise. Did you get my message back?
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Wasn't sure if
it's.
you
I
could do
mean,
that.
I think it's worth
Yeah.
doing. Yeah.
I have a gallbladder girl you and I were shooting the crap on. Um, she tripped over the stairs, woke up late for work, and broke her foot. And
Oh
it's like
no, that
we
sucks.
just finally got her back to work, and now she can't work for 8 weeks. So it's like,
Insult to injury.
right? Yeah. So I don't know. I figured,
Yeah, that's just bad luck,
yeah,
though.
yeah, yeah. It kind of sucks, dude, when you finally get things somewhat turned around the corner, and then life hits her in the balls.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah.
Um, cool. So we're getting some people jumping in. So today, we wanted to talk about. I want to talk about navigating complex cases, kind of an initial process, an initial look in those cases, because a lot of what Trey and I talk about around these cases revolves around finding some simplicity in the complexity and really understanding. People throw around this idea of like root cause coaching, right? And I think that's a good word to use here, because root cause coaching often involves the idea of figuring out what is the common denominator in these issues, like what is going to facilitate that process. But I think there's some pieces that are often missed, revolving around some things I think we should probably cover would be like micronutrients, inflammation, immune system, things like that, because that's a lot of what we're addressing initially. So in order to stay on track and maybe not get like too far into the weeds, I thought maybe we could cover those areas and then obviously kind of touch on mental health. I know that gets beat to death, so we'll see how much time we spend on that. But if, and you probably agree, I think 95% of cases probably come in and have a lot of, they may look a little bit different, but they have a lot of similar drivers, right? And those drivers, because what happens with these folks is each and every case probably starts as a stressor, right? And whatever that stressor might be, it can be something that's kind of obvious, or it can be something that's more deeply rooted in trauma, something that's maybe manifested over even an entire lifetime in some of these people, disordered eating and childhood trauma, and there's a whole lot that can go into it. So we have that initial stressor, and then we start to form some dysfunction. So the dysfunction kind of starts as like the stress response in the body. So we have the cortisol, we have the sympathetic nervous system, like we have all these things being stimulated. And what we start to see over time, and we see this like manifest a lot in like the lab work, for example, is we start seeing issues with white blood cells. We start seeing issues with inflammatory markers. We start seeing issues with micronutrient deficiencies, even though some of these people are eating micronutrients already. Like maybe some of them have some room for improvement dietary, but you work with a lot more general population. But even a lot of my competitors, like there's people that have what look like relatively complete diets and are still exhibiting a lot of these deficiencies. And so this is the kind of stuff that we're initially looking at addressing with people. Because the way I think about it is, and we can start with the micronutrition, is you need the match to light the fire, right? These are kind of like a way to initiate or a catalyst for a lot of these processes. So you can throw the protocols at them. You can throw even HRT into the mix in a lot of these individuals. And while you're going to see some symptom improvement because hormones elevate, you don't have the raw materials to metabolize the hormones correctly or utilize the hormones correctly. And so you just see kind of a poor effect. So maybe let's start with what are maybe the most common nutrient deficiencies or what specific markers are we looking at? Because I know there's a few that we see in like almost every person, and then we'll dive in from there. So what are maybe a few of the most common?
If we're going to use like blood markers, ALP is almost always going to be out for everyone. Alkaline phosphatase, almost always. Now, how out, it depends. But I would say that's a common one. And usually if that's low, it depends on how low. If I'm seeing like the 50s or something like that, I'm going to think, okay, maybe there's a zinc issue, maybe there's a B vitamin issue, maybe vitamin C. So just overall micronutrients. But then some of these people are so stressed, we see their ALP in the 20s or in the teens. I had one today, he was 18, super stressed business owner, that type of thing. That's usually going to be more magnesium related, which again goes to the stress and adrenal aspect. So I'd say ALP is probably one of the most common one. The other thing I would say is almost always off is either the white blood cells are going to be really high or they're going to be really, really low. Almost every single time. Which that can mean some things. I don't usually go over it and say like there's a current infection. That's just not me. There's usually always an inflammation and like a stress component. So I think understanding why that could be off. But I would say those are the most two common ones I must see every single time. And I think if I added a third one, maybe some type of B vitamin deficiency is usually going to be off, which again, if we circle back to that, is it a stomach acid issue thing? Is that why there's a micronutrient issue? And that's where you could use things like MCV. You can maybe use some of the iron markers as that. You could maybe go back to the ALP thing. Those are kind of the top three I'm almost always seeing across the board. And I would say all three of them do come back to like some type of chronic stress or inflammation or thing like that.
Yep. Yeah. So good takeaway to start is get really good at reading CMPs and CBCs first. Like I say this to everyone. I'm like, you guys, you got to be able to read a CBC and a CMP and understand the correlation. So we'll break it down just a little bit further. So with especially the ALP, because that's being so common, with magnesium specifically, what we're seeing a lot of the time is we have this like recommended dose of magnesium. And I think a lot of coaches probably do supplement their clients with magnesium. You know, it's kind of the standard, 400 milligrams of mag glycinate before bed, that type of thing. That's pretty standard. I think a lot of people do that. You maybe even throw like vitamin D in there. That's another common one people are, supplementing with a lot. But what we're seeing with this specifically is we're seeing intake, but we're also seeing like kind of metabolic usage of this, because when we have these really high stress individuals, for lack of better terms, they're kind of like burning through it in a sense. They need this mineral to facilitate the adrenaline or norepinephrine, adrenaline, and basically the sympathetic response that they're having constantly. So their metabolic demand of the nutrient is higher. Now you throw in some weight training in there, and if the person's bigger, the requirement might go up even a little bit more. So like when I'm getting some of these bigger guys that are 250 plus, or just very heavily muscled, their requirements are going up even higher. So like you said, how out kind of depends on the person. You might see someone clear down in the single digits if it's extremely bad. Or you might see somebody, if we're looking at numbers, if we're getting down into those lower 50s, we're probably going to start looking at that marker specifically. And then we can decide, is this just like an overall nutrient deficiency, like you said? Do we need to increase magnesium intake? So if we are going more mag, when we're talking amounts, we may get up into 600, 800, 1,000 plus milligrams in a lot of these people. Now, I always tell people you can circle back on labs later once things are better, and you can always reduce the intake. I don't know how you do it exactly. Like when I get up into higher amounts, I generally spread dosing out more often than not. Like I had a individual the other day, and we went to hers very low. We went into 1,000 milligrams initially. she was eating 5 meals. We literally just did 200 milligrams
Yep.
per meal throughout the day. You can get into more specifics, like there's different forms that will have slightly different effects. Glycinate's pretty safe for most people. It absorbs well. You can do some combos with like a malate or a taurate if you have a lot of inflammation or you have like cardiac risk. Maybe you want that taurate form a little more cardioprotective. We talked about that with like COVID vaccines, maybe GI issues. You're getting some of that benefit from it. But a safe bet is to maybe just go for a multiform magnesium. And a lot of people, and you're going to cover your bases. There's a lot of them. The one thing I always look at too is when you read a label for magnesium, understand that it's going to say this much is really concentrated for this amount, because everything has a carrier attached to it. So it might say 500 milligrams, which yields 100 milligrams of magnesium. So it's probably not going to be one capsule. To my knowledge, there's nothing on the market that is dosed that high. So when we're talking about these amounts, I mean, we're talking like 6, 8, 10, 12 caps. And a lot of these people spread throughout the day, depending on the product that you're using. So, and then, like I said, you can always reassess later once things calm down and you can readjust the dose a little bit. Myself, when I get deeper into the fat loss phases, I've watched my ALP over the years, and that's something that I always historically have issues with. So I normally increase that amount of magnesium intake when I get further into it, because what's happening? Stress response is going up. What is your body living on in that state? It's like cortisol and adrenaline, bro. Got to keep my blood sugar up. Got to stay alive. So that's probably the biggest one. If I pull a lab where there's not a low ALP, it's pretty much a miracle at this point.
It's about, like, I would say 9 out of 10. It's almost always going to be off a little.
In the cases we get, anyhow. Maybe not everyone, but more often than not, it's there. The other, you mentioned white blood cells. That one, and I totally agree with you on the white blood cells. We can see, usually like chronically, we start to see them lower. We'll see them, we're getting down like in the 4s, the 3s. Sometimes you may even get the old alert flag on there where it's like, alert, you're at a 1.8, And so if you guys go on Google and you look up like extreme white blood cell deficiency, you're going to pull all kinds of scary stuff, right? So maybe don't do that. But when we have this chronic stressor and this chronic inflammation over time, the initial response is that we have an overproduction of white blood cells to try to cope with whatever it is, like a gut issue or, whatever's going on. And then we end up with a low count eventually once that stress becomes chronic enough. So, like you said, it's not specific. It could be.
It also depends literally just be like the breakdown, like what is making up the actual white blood cells. And I think that's something that most people don't pay attention to. Like, if I'm looking at them, where I get concerned is if I see the lymphocytes like really, really, really low. That's mainly the one I get super paranoid about. I'm like, hey, do you mind going into the doctor and checking XYZ? Yeah. That is one I'm a little bit more concerned with. But something like neutrophils, simply training the day before can cause a drastic rise or a drastic drop in them, because initially they're going to raise up to repair and then they're going to drop back down. So if you're someone that trains balls to the wall 24/7, I wouldn't be surprised if they're completely tanked in the 1s and something like that. Like, so I think it's important to read the context of that. Or if you're someone that has like more gut permeability, I wouldn't be surprised to see like the monocytes, eosinophils, basophils a little bit wonky, either super high or super low when you combine them all. So I think it's important to go through and see, well, why are these off in the first place? But before just looking at the overall white blood cells, because there's so many things that can make it up and so many questions that we need to ask to figure out, well, what could have happened here, or what are they taking that could throw that off? And I think like back to the micronutrient deficiencies, the amount of like people I will talk to that aren't realizing just some of the things that they're taking, whether from the doctor or not, are creating these micronutrient deficiencies in the first place. Like, think about the amount of clients we get with like IBD that are on like some type of autoimmune med
Or
that we're
PPI
seeing. Yeah.
all,
And they're just throwing it
all the
off.
time.
And we're just automatically thinking, oh, this person has SIBO. It's like, well, no, let's take a step further. Like, we can see just metformin alone can cause a B vitamin deficiency. So like, we need to be thinking about that stuff as well at the same time. So I think that's the other part to think about. That maybe, like, I'm sure we notice it in the mentorship group or any coaches we talk to, that maybe they're not digging a little bit deeper in these things. And we're still, and we see it in the group sometimes, we're still so hyper focused on this marker. Whereas like, we could use just those 3 markers with the ALP, all the white blood cells, and maybe one other marker, and you can kind of figure out a pretty good depiction of what's going on if you know what's going on with the person without needing every single test or anything. And through all of that, no matter what the issue is, just supporting the micronutrients and supporting it is going to make some really good headway before rushing to the protocol stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And you brought up a good point. I wanted to touch on this a little bit more, was when you're looking at those white blood cells, you're probably looking at a CBC with differential is what we want. So that differential, it breaks down the specific types and the amounts. And we're not focusing so much on the percentage-based numbers as we are the absolutes, which, so for your guys' reference, it'll literally give you a range. Like, it's an actual value, right? The percentage number is just going to give you an idea of what percentage of each type is present. So you want to really focus more on the absolute values, which will give you a readout of the total amounts. So just for reference, if you guys start looking at that stuff, like you mentioned the B vitamins, and I'm on board with you on that. It's not that I definitely supplement people with B vitamins, but the caveat is that generally anyone that's eating animal proteins probably is not under consuming B vitamins. Probably. It's unlikely. So you have a medication, you have an absorption issue, you have a stomach acid issue, you've got something that's causing it. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't supplement with it, even if it's not permanent, but chances are, outside of somebody that's coming in with like really low consumption of nutrients, which can happen, there's probably more of an absorption issue than anything with those. So just kind of keep that in mind, I would say. But yeah, so those 3, no disagreement, by far are the most common. I would maybe throw vitamin D in there as kind of like a, honorable mention, just because we're looking at that like 25 hydroxy, and it's low a lot of the time. And there can be a lot of things like where you live, what time of year is it, so on and so forth. And the thing with vitamin D deficiency is that it doesn't happen right away. I mean, it's stored in tissues. So if you have a vitamin D deficiency, you probably had one for a little while. It's something that like takes time to manifest. So if you can do those few things alone and get proficient at that, you can really do well. The funny thing is, literally on my last call, we were breaking this down like really specifically, and the amount of people that I'll get inquire, and they're like, hey, so-and-so said you've got the, it's like you got the secret sauce. And I'm like, yeah, take more magnesium. And they're like, what? I'm like, they're like, well, I take magnesium. I'm like, we need more.
Right.
and unfortunately, these are just precursors to all the things that we have to do with these people before we get into anything else. So
the magnesium thing is just, you got to dose it enough. Like, I think I'll usually do like 50 to 100 milligrams per like 10 to 15 kilograms, depending on the person. And then what I know about them, if they're super stressed, they're probably going to do more. Like you mentioned, like the different versions, like I wouldn't go out there and just be taking a bunch of like magnesium citrate or like oxide or something like that. But that's like a really good one that I think a lot of people miss. And you're covering, if you think from multifaceted aspect, you're covering a lot of stuff there. Like you're covering the ALP, you're covering blood glucose, you're covering sleep, you're covering calming their CNS. Like there's so many things that you're getting with that um, that's like an easy one that you can almost always pick up, or easy one that everyone watching this can learn from.
Yeah, for sure. We talked about at the beginning, we mentioned immune system, inflammation. The white blood cell thing kind of plays into that already. So kind of like lightly touched on that. But there's, with GI issues being so common, that's one of the things we're going to see a lot of the time is there's an initial inflammation response, obviously from whatever the issue is, and then that generally becomes chronic. And that can be for a number of reasons. Maybe you do have an active infection. Maybe you do have SIBO. Maybe you do have something that's driving that, or I should say, like, or maybe you have a situation where you also don't have the ability to control and mitigate the inflammation that's being produced. So you might be getting a normal or quote unquote normal inflammation response. You just don't have the feedback loop that controls it. So it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And a lot of people start looking at stuff like CRP, for example. Right. Dude, I mean, the amount of times that I see normal CRPs in people that have chronic inflammation is, I mean, a lot of them. Right. So understand first and foremost that most of the direct inflammation markers you measure are non-specific and they might not be elevated. So ESR and CLP, CRP, and there's a whole bunch of them. And you can measure all these different inflammatory cytokines and stuff, and you may see them raised, you may not. And that means absolutely nothing. I mean, I'm not going to say it means nothing, but it doesn't necessarily tell you whether or not there is inflammation present in the body. So the response of the inflammation is very normal. That's the first thing. So understand, like, that's a normal response. We need it. But when it gets out of control and dysregulated, then we have this immune system that starts running away. And now what happens? Now we start creating potential autoimmunity. We start creating imbalances. And this is where a lot of the time, a lot of your common autoimmune issues, I say common because, like something like Hashimoto's might be common. But when I say common, I'm really talking about stuff like eczema and psoriasis and hives and rashes and histamine intolerance and stuff like that. That's the kind of stuff that we're seeing most often in people, and they just kind of put it off as something completely unrelated. Joint pain, right? Like I posted that in my story today. Like literally the screenshot I posted in my story today was the guy talking about, he's 48 years old, and he's talking about how outside of some old, actual injuries he has, it's like, dude, my joints feel great. I mean, it's not going to fix your torn labrum, but a lot of these people, I've literally had young people come in with going to rheumatologists, and they're trying to give them, RA diagnoses. And they don't have any problems with their joints. They get an MRI, they have imaging done, nothing. There's no tissue degradation. There's nothing. So a lot of this is stemming from that dysregulation in the immune system. So a question now becomes, do we do anything about that directly? And if so, what do we do? And so maybe let's start there, because I know that's really broad, but there's a couple things we could probably intervene with.
Right. Like, are you thinking, are you wanting to talk supplement wise?
Well, yeah, we can talk about a couple staples. We can't give away all the answers.
I think like the easiest thing, like, I mean, if I were going to say two that I always use, I wouldn't say always, but I would say a high majority, especially some of these ones that have done like 30 freaking kill off protocols. are living off of the kill off supplements that can't get better is just colostrum and then like a quercetin or curcumin, maybe blend. And I would say almost every single time, what do you know? After a few weeks, they're not having any issues. And that tells me a few things. That tells me, one, the immune system was super, super wonky. Two, histamine was most likely an issue, but also three, it was most likely inflammation to begin with. And all three of those things work on that. That's probably like the easiest thing to do because it's a bit more multifaceted. You're going to have like more than one benefit. I think from a supplement wise, that's key. I think from a nutrition wise, I'm a huge fan of just flooding the body full of like fruits, veggies. I will probably overdo the fruits sometimes and the fruit juices for some that they're like, dude, like I'm spending $100 a week just on fruits, but it's like, listen, like there's so many benefits to it. And from a stress perspective and adrenal perspective, it's just going to help so much. And then the other one is just pushing up that fats and not being afraid to do it. That's like some of the main things I'll do. And then training, I always just like to pull all the training out, get you outside. Like, if you want to do cardio, fine, let's get you outside to walk. Like, get the same thing. Let's maybe adjust some of your training down. Let's remove some of the intensity techniques. That's usually where I'm always starting across the board with everyone. Now, obviously, like there's some caveats to there, but that's the easiest place that I feel most people could start. You could give them some like box breathing and crap like that to help, but in my opinion, like if you're talking supplements, that's going to do much more for someone than say like a vitamin C or like a immune system supplement type thing. That's just how I usually approach it.
Yeah. So we're breaking this down into environmental inflammation creators or drivers, and then supplementary. So, you know, one of the things, like one of the underlying themes was that we're not putting people into protocols. However, getting some type of result at the beginning is super important. So don't take the conversation as you should, because the reality of the situation is just telling somebody to stop doing something is not going to be that effective for most people.
At times,
like, is that maybe the answer? Yeah, and that might be. Listen, on paper, that might be a really good answer. It's just that anytime that we can actually get someone to see something and see a result, that's going to automatically reduce sympathetic response in that person. Whether you realize it or not, and whether you think about it or not, if your joints don't hurt as much, you are going to be less stressed. If you're not looking at your skin every day and being like, there it is, you're going to feel something, right? So I like the ones that you mentioned. You kind of talked about like mast cell, right? It's like quercetin. You talked about our quercetin. We've got like more multifaceted, you know, something like the colostrum in there with the like high immunoglobulin counts, and then and there's a few other ones we might sprinkle in, like the PEA and the boswellia, depending on the cases, and going higher dose with curcumin and stuff like that. And that's more case specific, depending on how much we think we need to hit it. But that's a great place to start. And then, of course, environmentally, trying to figure out what can we realistically reduce. And the sense of urgency for me around that really depends on how bad the issue is, right? It really just depends. I mean, if it's a case where somebody legitimately thinks they have a rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis, or they're so inflamed that they can't function, it's kind of urgent. You know, we have to take a little more extreme action. For other people, it could literally just be like a slight pullback in some of those areas, and the supplements will do a lot for them, and then we can roll from there. But I think when we're looking at immune system, we're kind of looking at assisting the body in those counter processes, right? Because it's doing the initial process, which is the creating the inflammation. It's just that the counterbalance is not there. And so that's where some of that supplementation and some of those other modalities come in. And I agree with you. I mean, as far as some of the popular modalities like doing the box breathing and meditation and journaling and stuff, very person specific. Works great for some people. For other people, maybe it's something you can do later when you get to a point where you can actually sit down and do it. Or maybe that's just not even a thing for you. And that's kind of like personality dependent a lot of the time. And it's also one of those things where I have to take into consideration what their day looks like and what their schedule looks like. I mean, I don't really feel good about introducing this like biohacking 33-step routine when someone gets out of bed in the morning if they barely have time to put their pants on before they walk out the door. Like, practicality comes into play as well. The funny thing about that, not to go too far off track, is that even something like, there's a lot of people, they think they maybe don't have time for those things, and that could be true, but even something as simple as helping, especially in Gen Pop people, and even in competitors some, is helping people understand, how do I want to phrase this, how to be more efficient at certain processes. So for example, I've had people that I come to find out, they're like, it's taking me hours and hours and hours to prep my food. I'm like, okay, what did I missed maybe I missed something there. Maybe I didn't give them the tools, or maybe I just assumed that they knew they could use the Instapot or the whatever. But that's not always the case. Like, sometimes if I look at someone that has a 9-to-5 job and no kids and all this stuff, I'm like, why do you not?
Right.
What are you doing?
Right.
There's got to be time for you. I can't go out and walk for 20 minutes. I'm like, okay, something's going on here. Either A, you're doom scrolling for 4 hours or something. But that can even be a conversation with people. I've noticed is just like reorganizing.
It's almost like
the structure of the day.
Like, that's one thing I like to do is, like, I always give when I hear people say it takes them hours to meal prep, I'm like, God, I don't want to hear that. Like, you and I are super busy, and we still manage. Obviously, we work from home, and we obviously have some help with like our partners and stuff. But we still, like, with how cramped some of our schedules are, or some of the people that I help that have ridiculous schedules, like beyond stuff that overwhelms me every time I have to answer the update or talk to them about it. They're still getting it done, but they've also figured out a process. They're not getting cute with their meals. So, like, a good example I give people is, if you think about when people are cooking their food, they're usually just cooking one thing and they go sit around and mess around the rest of the time. Well, why don't you do this? It's like, put your meat in the Instant Pot or oven or grill or whatever. While that's going on, maybe get your veggies steaming in the microwave or on the stove or the rice cooker, or you could have your rice cooking and steaming the veggies at the same time. And then while that's going on, if you've got fruit, maybe do frozen fruit or fresh fruit and start measuring out that stuff while everything is going on. And then as things finish, you can keep measuring. And then by the time you finish most things, the meat's probably finalizing, being done. You can go ahead and measure that. And I know when Valerie used to go to work, I could meal prep 5 days of meals in an hour and a half at most while doing my normal stuff. Or like with me for getting walks, I always schedule a lot of my stuff to do while I'm walking outside. So I'll schedule my phone calls, or maybe to talk to my dad or stuff like that. I'll schedule stuff at the same time. That way, a lot of us might be time poor, that it's just getting better at using your time. And that's like a very common one you'd see, or maybe someone's just complicating the process too much. Some of these routines that people tell me, I'm like, you're grasping at straws everywhere to get better, that you're just complicating your life even more, that you can simplify it. Maybe find one or two things you enjoy that help bring you back to baseline and chill you out. That those are a few things that you could get done, make your life a little bit easier, and you're still getting everything done, not complicating your life at the same time, not causing that constant stress response we're seeing some of these people have.
Yeah, and one that I ran into today was they were forgetting to take their supplements. I'm like, okay, what are you doing? You're like, what are you doing? They're like, well, I just have bottles lying around everywhere. I'm like, okay, have you ever thought maybe putting them in an organizer?
Right.
Because I actually, I mean, I try to make things simple as far as like taking stuff with meals or upon waking, like times that you can remember to do it. I've got a giant organizer. I pretty much will throw everything in there for a week at a time. It's already there. Time to eat, grab it. If I have to leave, I throw it in my little smaller one, take it with me, whatever. So even just stuff like that, especially when you're getting into more supplementation, is there's no reason to be forgetting all this stuff, and it's just a matter of routine, and it's just a matter of prioritization and habits. And if you do it repetitively, it's not, it's not going to be difficult. So that's not only that, but it's going to make you a lot less stress when you have a solid routine where you can execute these things, because it's always, I know when I start working with people, and as we go through the process, I can always tell the ones that are going to do the best, their updates get simpler, they get more efficient, they get better at it. It's just software, like we talk about. It's just software in the brain. They're just doing it. There's less attachment to things. There's less thought put into things. And slowly over time, all of that adds up.
Yep.
It's like the reference that you had used, and I used something different. It's like, stress is, it's like Chinese water torture, just dripping on your forehead forever. You had mentioned talking about a needle hole in the back is not a problem until you have a giant hole in your back with lots of, and that's really all of this stuff will add up. Now, the key to all of this is doing it in a way that doesn't create hyperfixation. But that's where we come into play. And if you are working with a coach, you should not be hyperfixating. So let's kind of finish out this call with maybe a couple points on that mental aspect of it, because if you do work with a coach, the whole point of a coach is, well, there's a few. One is obviously the information. One is obviously we have a lot of experience, a lot of things that you don't specialize in. I have an accountant, you have an accountant. We give them our information and we're like, yo, do it. I don't want to hear about it unless I have to.
Yep.
Right? Now, part of that beyond the information is we are here to organize the information. So part of our job is we are organizing and laying it out in a way that's practical and hopefully simplistic enough for the person to be able to follow it, and it's less for them to think about. So that's kind of how you need to view a coach, is you're also paying for organization of all this stuff, because a vast majority of these people, I'm not going to say all of them, but a vast majority of these people are trying to do way too much stuff. They've pulled little bits from the last 5 coaches they've worked with, or they pulled little bits from the internet or from Instagram or from YouTube or wherever, and they've kind of just thrown it in there based on a symptom and reaction approach. They're like, I have this, I think I have this, I'm going to take this. When really, if you listen to the beginning of our call, we're talking about multifaceted items, multifaceted modalities that are going to cover a lot of areas very simply. So that's just something to really keep in mind, I think, when you do hire someone, is like, you gotta let off the gas a little bit mentally and let them do their job.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think one of the first things I tell people to do is maybe take a social media break, or maybe silence some of all the people, because some people are just following. Let's say they have SIBO. They're following every SIBO expert out there, and we're all saying something different. You're already getting in the way of anyone getting anywhere. That's one thing I'll do. In terms of for like the clients, I try to find what is the simplest approach for them to make them think less. So like, for one, with check-ins, I will customize the check-in to them. I will remove certain questions that I think they're going to fixate on. I think that's an easy one. I think I call it a tracking deload. Maybe I have them not weigh their food for a period of time, or maybe we change the measurement of how they, or the way they measure things. Maybe they use cups and tablespoons, or maybe they use their hands. That's one less thing they got to think about. Maybe I give them more of a flexible like plan where there's a few different options that they can rotate, give them a little bit of variety. Because the other thing is I don't want my people to feel a prisoner to whatever's going on. Because if you give them too strict of a plan, they feel like, oh, I can't do this. They have the fear of missing out. Those are a few things I always do with everyone. I will build in certain types of meals I want them to have. But I think the other big thing I'll try to push them to do is they got to get back to some type of hobby, and they got to tell me about it. I think that's a really big one. I think that's a form of self-care. And I think that also replaces a lot of that time where you maybe worry, I'm broken, I'm this or that, or we know some of these people have an identity issue. They identify as their issue versus my name is Sally, I happen to be struggling with XYZ type of thing. Those are a few things I really hyper focus on. But I think that the biggest thing is I've always made it a goal to simplify everything as much as humanly possible. And I know the whole trend now is to be anti-protocol. Like, and I did a live on this. Like, I'm somewhere in between. Like, I still
if it makes sense, it makes sense. So that's just gotta.
There's sometimes where, unfortunately, I've got to go as a really extreme, and I don't like to do that. There's other times we don't need to do that. And there might be times where even if I feel we need to do that, maybe I don't think you're in a good mental space, or maybe you're just that hard on a budget that I'm not going to put you in an even more stressful situation. And that's another thing I do is I ask everyone, like, please give me an actual hard number. What can you work with budget wise? But also something I came across with a newer gal of mine is I never thought about it. I've gotten a lot of addicts over the years, and past addict myself, and still battle stuff like that. Like, I never realized until I was working with this girl that she had said her last coach put her on like 10 to 15 different things. And I saw some merit in some of it I didn't. But she was saying, hey, this was really triggering of my past addict to pills. I was like, well, cool. Well, why don't we just change the way we use certain things? Why don't we simplify it to less pills and things like that, where we went as far as to find a prenatal that didn't have all the pills. Like one of the prenatals I like with Seeking Health, it's 8 capsules. I was like, well, let's use the more basic one that's 2 capsules. Let's maybe change your magnesium to more powder. Let's maybe find something that has like blends that are broken down of how much is in each one. And we found there's a night and day difference in how she feels when on paper, the plan's really doing the same thing. She's just not hyper fixating on it all the time. Right. And I've also explained to everyone, like, I'm not looking for perfection. I would love, like you and I would love for perfection from people, but in reality, we're not going to get that. So I always start everyone, and it's in their update, like when we ask about adherence, we're human, we're not perfect. I expect you to mess up. Like that, the one expectation, I have 2 expectations. Give consistent effort to the best of your ability, but also understand that I know you're not going to be perfect. And that is a full expectation I have of everyone, no matter what level you are. You could be Mr. Olympia, or you could be Bobby Joe down the street. I expect you to not hit some sort of thing that I would like you to hit. And I find simply removing that, I've seen a lot of, especially the females, make a lot of improvements because they're not hyper fixating, where last coaches have told them, you have to do X, Y, Z. If you don't do this, you will fail. You will not get better. And simply removing that fear or that stress of I've got to be perfect, to teaching them, hey, like, you could be 6 months perfect on plan, and then the other 6 months you be 20% off of plan. That averages about 50 to 60%. Or we can leave a little wiggle room where you might be 100% one week, 80 the next week, 60 next week, that you average out about
much better average.
Yeah, and you're still getting the same place, and we've removed that expectation of being perfect from the get-go. So those are a few things I try to do with everyone. Yeah. And I found with some of the the newer cases that have been through all the crazy protocols, that's all we've done. They still have some pretty complicated stuff, and they still, some are on like 10 supplements. But why is that plan working when the other plans didn't, that were all about killing and specific things? Well, I just met them where they're at. I met them where their budget's at. I was listening, just listening to them and hearing them out and saying, hey, I understand, like, you're dealing with this. This is not who you are. I'm sorry you've been led to believe XYZ is this, but I'm confident if we do this and we remove some of those worries you had and give yourself a little bit of grace, while also having grace under pressure and understanding there's sometimes I expect you to push through when life gets hard. But I still expect you to give yourself some grace if crappy circumstances come up.
Yeah, and a lot of that's in asking the right questions, having the right intake process, and just having some versatility in your approach. And we scale these things as we go based on the goals. It's not like measuring with your hands maybe is always what you're going to do, and that and also your goal, your goal is going to probably dictate how we need to scale that process and what level of adherence or what level of specificity we need within our plan. If I have, great example is, like, if I have a competitor that needs to get something done a little bit quicker to accomplish a competitive goal, like you had Ben, for example, and I get a lot of people like that. There's a little bit different sense of urgency. However, I also have a slightly different expectation with them, and I have to, if I'm going to be able to, adhere to some kind of timeline. But for a lot of these people, it's one step forward and 10 steps back over and over again. And the identity problems, unfortunately, are, in my experience, they're created in this space. So a lot of these people didn't know anything about SIBO. They didn't know anything about, progesterone and estrogen. They had no idea that a lot of these things were even a problem with them to begin with. And I cannot stress this enough, that people that they're listening to, whether it's just them reading stuff or looking up information themselves or even working with a coach, these problems are being created. Now, that's not to say that they don't already have some personality tendencies that kind of make them more susceptible to this type of stuff, but they're searching for answers. And when they find something that they resonate with, they have bias, so they're going to latch on to it. And there's a lot of things that can happen. It can become a crutch, kind of this victim mentality. There's a lot of ways that can manifest. But my underlying message is that if they didn't know any of these things, and I just came in and listened to their symptoms and looked at what information we have provided and addressed it, would any of that exist? And the answer is probably not.
Yeah.
And so you can see this, and you can see the severity of this gets worse the more that they're exposed to that stuff. The more coaches they've had, the more information that they've consumed, the more times they went down the rabbit hole. Now, granted, there's a select few individuals that can actually come in and provide something that's pretty meaningful, but it's not the norm. And even with people that are intelligent, that have experience in the coaching space, because I work with a lot of coaches as clients, they don't even do a good job of it most of the time. Sometimes they're worse because they know more than, they know more than your average person.
So much they're dangerous.
Exactly. So they know too much for their own good. So unfortunately, I would love for people to think about that. And that's something I say to people sometimes, like, well, if you didn't know anything about hormones and anything about the gut and anything about inflammation, immune system, nothing, would you know that you had this issue, or would it change the way that you viewed our conversations and our approach? And it's like,
and that might be something else. That's definitely something I've changed in the last year or so, that I've stopped using certain phrases and certain names.
Bingo.
Like, I never tell anyone they have SIBO or this or that. I'm just like, hey, we have a little bit of things going on. We're going to do this, address it. And I might not tell them everything verbatim.
Yep.
I'll give them a little
That's
bit
intentional.
Understand. But then I'm not saying, okay, we're going into your kill phase, we're going into your flush or your whatever other term, your slingshot method, all these terms we're using. I've found by not doing that, I'm not getting as many people react over. They're not getting the anxiety like, okay, I'm going into this kill phase, like what I'm going to expect. Because what we also see is some people get the nocebo effect, where they're automatically thinking, okay, I'm going to this phase, I'm expecting this to happen. And we see one of two things happen. Either they're expecting to feel worse.
Yep.
So they indirectly feel worse, even from something that shouldn't do anything, or they're expecting to get better. And then life is hitting them in the balls a few times and they don't get better. And they're like, well, no, this was the plan. Like, this didn't work. Well, we got to do another kill protocol. We've got to do another flush, or this coach doesn't know this, so I got to go here. I find just simply removing those things works a heck of a lot better than using those terms. And I have a lot of regret where I wish I never used those terms or said these phases are going to do this. And you mentioned like urgency. It's like, okay, there's a difference between getting better and good enough. Like, who is it? If it's a competitor, they might just be fine with being good enough
to accomplish the next thing.
Accomplish the next thing. Whereas even for some lifestyle people, let's say they needed some type of use Tuesday when we talked about the GI map. I give the perfect example to what's his name? Red-haired guy. With the Nick stuff. Nick, yes, it was with Nick. It was like that. We saw like parasites and stuff like that. And I said, well, like, based off of this lady, like, do we need to turn her life upside down to even entertain this stuff? Why don't we put a few things that she could just run for a very extended period of time and slowly get better and teach her to just be and learn how certain tendencies and habits can affect XYZ? That might be the most efficient thing for her, because no negative reaction might be the win we want. Even though we know they might need like something crazy, they might not be able to do that. They might not mentally be able to take that. They might go back to that I'm sick type of thing. So like those are all the few other things that I'll incorporate from now and then, because I think at times we still have to let people just be for a little bit. Like, what is your normal and what is your baseline? You've been doing every protocol in the book for 2 years straight.
And that's another thing, is like we need to assess their back history before we kind of make a call on that, because there definitely are cases where we maybe do jump into something a little bit more intensive initially, but I find that it's going to come one of two ways. Either A, they've never done anything and we have no idea how they're going to react, so hey, we probably shouldn't do that. Or B, they've already done everything, and so why do everything again right now?
Yeah.
Like, why do the same thing? And granted, we might be able to frame it a little bit differently or something, but chances are it's not going to be so drastically different that they're going to have a vastly different experience. However, if we go in and teach them how to be present and how to understand basic mechanisms and work through a lot of this basic stuff that we talked about for the last hour, now if we need to do something like that, oh man, it's a different ballgame. It works beautifully. And now we actually have a baseline that is going to give us some kind of foundation to run this protocol. But man, I love that you mentioned labels and all that stuff, and it's something we've talked about a lot, and it's something that I'm extremely selective with wording. It sometimes even comes off like you're downplaying stuff at times, but that's intentional, because listen, there's plenty of times where Trey and I have looked at stuff and we're like, oh shit, this looks bad.
Right.
But what good is it going to do for us to freak the client out? Now, if it's a dire situation where we've already done all this stuff and we have to like create a sense of urgency in the client, kind of like that ultimatum step, that's a different scenario, but we're not jumping to that. That's not a first step
Yep.
for most people. So cool, man. Dude, that was super useful. I really hope that people found a lot of value in that. I'll repost it and collab you and all that jazz so people can rewatch. And I will see you tomorrow.
Yeah, you'll see me
Probably.
tomorrow. Yeah.
Cool.
Cool,
See you,
man.
dude. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Talk to you soon.
I'll see you, buddy.